the spring of 1967, this was the county police station. One night, 17-year-old Daniel Hayes was brought in on a drunk and disorderly charge. By morning, he was dead in the holding cell.
The Kentucky Reckoning of 1967. Hayes brothers burned 12 police stations after police killed their son. The most devastating campaign of arson in Kentucky law enforcement history and the most systematic act of family vengeance the Appalachian coalfields had ever witnessed. This is the true story of the Hayes brothers. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, known throughout America as Bloody Harlan. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into violence. Hemmed in by the ancient Cumberland Mountains, the people who lived along the Poor Fork of the Cumberland River and its countless tributaries had been fighting for survival since the first settlers arrived. And for over 200 years, each succeeding generation had continued that fight. The isolation that had once defined these communities was beginning to break down by 1967. But the old ways of thinking, the old loyalties and hatreds remained as strong as ever. From the early period when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up through the labor wars of the 20th century, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This no doubt has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of mountains. The coal companies had controlled the law for decades, using sheriffs and deputies as their private armies, and the people had learned that official justice was merely another tool of oppression. That lesson had been taught in blood during the mine wars of the 1930s, and it had not been forgotten by 1967. You see, in these mountains, the relationship between the people and the police had always been adversarial. The law enforcement officers who patrolled these hollows were not seen as protectors, but as enforcers of a system that had exploited mountain people for generations. They had broken strikes, evicted families from company housing, and looked the other way, while mine owners violated every safety regulation on the books. When a deputy knocked on your door, it was rarely to help you. It was usually to collect a debt, serve a warrant, or deliver some other form of bad news. The badge was not a symbol of protection in Harlan County. It was a symbol of power wielded against those who had none. The Hayes family had lived in Harlan County for 5 generations, surviving the transition from subsistence farming to coal mining and back again as the industry's fortunes rose and fell. They were not wealthy by any measure, but they had maintained their independence through the worst times, refusing to become entirely dependent on the coal companies that had swallowed so many other families. The patriarch in 1967 was a man named Elijah Hayes, 62 years old, who had worked in the mines for 30 years before black lung forced him out. He had raised 7 sons on a small farm in the hollow above Evarts, teaching them the values that had sustained the family through generations of hardship. That's right. Elijah Hayes had raised his boys to be self-reliant, to trust family above all else, and to never accept injustice without response. These were the values of the mountains, passed down from father to son since the first Hayes ancestor had crossed the Cumberland Gap. They were values that had served the family well through hard times, values that had kept them together when other families had scattered. But they were also values that could lead to terrible consequences when the injustice was great enough and the response was proportionate to the wrong. The 7 Hayes brothers ranged in age from 42 to 28 in 1967, all of them married, most of them fathers themselves. The eldest was Thomas, a quiet man who had taken over management of the family farm when their father's health failed. Next came William, who worked at the remaining mine in the county. Then James, who had served in Korea and returned with a hardness that had never entirely faded. Then Robert, who operated a small garage in Evarts. Then Charles, who had left the county for a few years, but returned when the pull of family proved too strong. Then David, who had followed his brother into the army and served in Vietnam. And finally, Samuel, the youngest, who had stayed home to help with the farm and who had a gift for machinery that made him valuable throughout the hollow. Among the next generation of Hayes children, none was more beloved than a young man named Michael, the only son of Thomas Hayes. Michael was 19 years old in 1967. a bright and promising boy who had graduated from high school the previous spring and who was planning to attend college in the fall. He would be the first member of the Hayes family to pursue higher education, a source of enormous pride for his father and grandfather. Michael had received a scholarship to Berea College, where he intended to study engineering and eventually return to help develop the county he loved. He represented hope for the family, a bridge to a future that might be different from the past. The path to that scholarship had been paved by years of hard work and determination. Michael had attended the small high school in Evarts, where he had distinguished himself not just academically, but as a leader among his peers. He had organized study groups for students who were struggling, had started a tutoring program for younger children in the Hollow, and had represented the school at regional academic competitions. His teachers recognized his potential and encouraged him to aim higher than most mountain boys dared to dream. The decision to attend Berea College had not come easily. The college was nearly 100 miles away, farther than any Hayes had traveled for anything other than military service. The family had debated whether Michael should stay closer to home, whether the risks of sending their brightest hope into an unfamiliar world were worth taking. In the end, Michael himself had made the argument that convinced them. He would go, he would learn, and he would return with knowledge that could help the entire community. He saw his education not as an escape from the mountains, but as a way to serve them better. The summer before his planned departure had been filled with preparation and anticipation. Michael had worked on the family farm during the days, saving money for books and expenses that the scholarship would not cover. In the evenings, he had attended meetings of the Appalachian Volunteers, a group of young people who were working on poverty issues and community development throughout the region. He had found in that organization a sense of purpose that complemented his academic ambitions, a belief that change was possible if people were willing to work for it. His involvement with the Appalachian Volunteers had attracted attention, not all of it welcome. Sheriff Morgan and his deputies viewed any organization that talked about change and reform as a potential threat, and they kept informal watch on the group's members. Michael had been stopped and questioned several times over the summer, encounters that had been unpleasant but not violent. He had learned to be careful, to carry his identification at all times, to be polite even when the deputies were rude. He believed that his caution would protect him. He was wrong. Michael Hayes had inherited his grandfather's strong sense of justice and his father's quiet determination. He was not a troublemaker by nature, preferring books to fights and conversation to confrontation. But he had grown up hearing stories of the mine wars, of the battles that his grandfather and great-uncles had fought against the coal companies and their hired guns. He understood that there were times when a man had to stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. This understanding would lead him to a confrontation that would end his life and set in motion a chain of events that would change Harlan County forever. Now, to understand what happened in the summer of 1967, you need to understand the tensions that had been building in Harlan County for years. That's right. The civil rights movement had reached even these remote mountains, inspiring young people to question the systems that had oppressed their families for generations. The war on poverty had brought federal money and federal attention to Appalachia, challenging the power structures that had controlled the region for decades. And the Vietnam War had created divisions within communities, with some families proud of their sons' service and others increasingly opposed to a conflict that seemed to have no end. The year 1967 was a particularly volatile moment in American history, and Harlan County felt those tensions as acutely as anywhere in the nation. The previous summer had seen riots in major cities, expressions of rage against racism and poverty that had shocked white America and galvanized black communities. The anti-war movement was growing, with protests spreading from college campuses to the streets of small towns. Young people everywhere were questioning the authority of their elders, challenging traditions that had seemed immutable, demanding changes that their parents found incomprehensible. In Harlan County, these national currents mixed with local grievances that stretched back decades. The coal industry, that had once provided employment for thousands, had contracted dramatically, leaving communities without economic foundation. The war on poverty programs had promised help, but had delivered mostly bureaucracy, with funding controlled by the same political machines that had always run the county. The old order was crumbling, but nothing had emerged to replace it, and the resulting vacuum had created opportunities for both hope and despair. The Appalachian Volunteers that Michael Hayes had joined represented one response to this situation, an attempt by young people to take control of their own futures rather than waiting for help that might never come. They organized voter registration drives, challenged corrupt officials, and tried to build power for communities that had always been powerless. Their work was peaceful and legal, but it threatened the established order in ways that men like Sheriff Morgan could not tolerate. To him, any challenge to the way things had always been was a threat that had to be suppressed. The tension between the old order and those who sought change had been building throughout 1967, expressing itself in confrontations that grew more frequent and more hostile as the summer progressed. Deputies harassed young people who attended meetings, followed cars, took down license plate numbers, made clear that they were watching and waiting for any excuse to act. The message was clear. Stay in your place, accept things as they are, or face consequences that might include more than just harassment. The Harlan County Sheriff's Department in 1967 was led by a man named Luther Morgan, a former coal company security guard who had transitioned into official law enforcement when the mines began to close. Morgan was 54 years old and had been sheriff for 12 years, maintaining his position through a combination of political alliances and ruthless suppression of anyone who challenged his authority. He ran the department like a personal fiefdom, hiring deputies based on loyalty rather than competence, and using his office to settle scores and reward friends. The badge gave him power, and he used that power without restraint. Morgan had clashed with the Hayes family on multiple occasions over the years, though never seriously enough to escalate into open conflict. He resented their independence, their refusal to show the deference he expected from the people he policed. The Hayes brothers had never been arrested, had never given him any legitimate excuse to move against them. But Morgan had made clear through various means that he considered them troublemakers who would eventually need to be dealt with. The tension between the sheriff and the family had simmered for years, waiting for a spark that would ignite it into something worse. The spark came on a hot July evening when Michael Hayes was driving home from a meeting of the Appalachian Volunteers, a group of young people working on poverty issues in the region. The meeting had been held in the county seat, and Michael was taking the back roads home to avoid the traffic on the main highway. He was alone in his father's pickup truck, thinking about the discussion they had had about voter registration and community organizing. He was not thinking about trouble. He had no reason to expect any, and that's when Deputy Earl Whitmore pulled him over on a deserted stretch of road above the Poor Fork. You see, Earl Whitmore was exactly the kind of deputy that Sheriff Morgan preferred to hire. He was 31 years old, a high school dropout who had found in law enforcement the authority he had never been able to earn any other way. He had a reputation for brutality that even his fellow deputies found excessive, a willingness to use violence that went beyond anything the job required. He had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years, complaints that Sheriff Morgan had dismissed or buried. Whitmore was useful precisely because he was willing to do things that other deputies would hesitate to do. Whitmore had been watching Michael for weeks, noting his movements, observing his attendance at Appalachian volunteer meetings, building a picture of a young man who represented everything he despised. Michael was educated, ambitious, respected in his community, everything that Whitmore was not and knew he could never be. The resentment had festered throughout the summer, growing stronger each time Whitmore saw the young man driving through town or talking with his friends. He had been waiting for an opportunity to assert his authority, to remind Michael Hayes that the badge gave him power that no amount of education could match. The stretch of road where Whitmore made his stop was carefully chosen. It was isolated, far from any houses, with no streetlights and no witnesses who might complicate whatever happened. Whitmore had driven past Michael on the main road and had recognized the pickup truck, had followed at a distance until Michael turned onto the back road, had waited until they were deep in the darkness before activating his lights. He had a story prepared, a reason for the stop that would satisfy any official inquiry. He had been thinking about this moment for weeks. The official report that Whitmore filed later that night claimed that Michael Hayes had been driving erratically. that he had failed to stop when signaled, and that he had become violent when finally pulled over. The report claimed that Whitmore had been forced to use his weapon in self-defense, firing 3 times when Michael lunged at him with a tire iron. The report was a lie from beginning to end, but it was the only official account of what happened on that road. Sheriff Morgan declared the shooting justified within 24 hours. The truth, pieced together from physical evidence and the testimony of a witness who came forward weeks later, was very different. Michael had pulled over immediately when he saw the flashing lights, had remained in his vehicle as instructed, and had been cooperative throughout the initial contact. Whitmore had ordered him out of the truck, had searched him roughly and had found nothing illegal. Then, for reasons that were never adequately explained, Whitmore had begun beating the young man with his nightstick. Michael had tried to defend himself, had tried to get back to his truck, and Whitmore had shot him 3 times in the back as he fled. The witness was a woman named Sarah Collins, who had been walking home from a neighbor's house when she heard the commotion and hid in the brush beside the road. She saw everything, saw the beating and the shooting, and Whitmore standing over Michael's body for several minutes before calling for backup. She saw Whitmore place a tire iron near Michael's hand, a weapon that had not been there before. She was terrified of what she had witnessed, terrified of what would happen if she came forward, but eventually her conscience would not let her remain silent. The Hayes family learned of Michael's death at 2 o'clock in the morning when Sheriff Morgan himself came to deliver the news. He offered no condolences, no explanation beyond the official report that painted Michael as the aggressor. He seemed almost pleased to be delivering such devastating news to a family he had despised for years. Thomas Hayes listened in silence as the sheriff spoke, his face revealing nothing of the fury building inside him. When Morgan left, Thomas gathered his brothers and told them what had happened. The reckoning that followed would burn across Harlan County like a wildfire. The funeral of Michael Hayes drew over 500 people to the small church in Evarts, representatives of families from throughout the county who came to pay their respects to a young man who had represented hope for all of them. The casket was closed because of the damage Whitmore's bullets had done, a fact that only intensified the grief and anger of those who attended. Thomas Hayes stood at the graveside without speaking, his face a mask that concealed emotions too powerful to express. His brothers stood beside him, a wall of silent fury that everyone present could feel. The service itself was led by the pastor, who had baptized Michael as an infant, and who had watched him grow into the young man who now lay in the closed casket before the altar. The pastor spoke of Michael's promise, of the plans he had made for college, of the engineering degree he would never earn, and the contributions he would never make. He spoke of the injustice of a life cut short, of a future stolen by violence. He stopped short of naming the killer or accusing the sheriff's department, but everyone present understood the subtext of his words. The church was filled beyond capacity, with mourners standing along the walls and spilling out onto the steps. Many of those present had never known Michael personally, but they had known of him, had heard about the bright young man who was going to college, who was going to be the first Hayes to earn a degree. His death felt like a loss to the entire community, a theft of something that belonged to all of them. The anger in that church was palpable, a collective fury that seemed to press against the walls. Among the mourners were representatives of the Appalachian Volunteers, young people who had worked alongside Michael in the weeks before his death. They sat together in a pew near the back, their faces marked by grief and by a different kind of anger than the older mourners showed. To them, Michael's death was not just a family tragedy, but a political assassination, the killing of a young man who had dared to challenge the established order. They had come to honor their fallen comrade and to recommit themselves to the work he had died believing in. Outside the church, deputies from Sheriff Morgan's department had positioned themselves at a distance, ostensibly to manage traffic, but clearly to observe who attended and to send a message that the sheriff was watching. Their presence infuriated the mourners, who saw it as a final insult, a reminder of the power that had taken Michael's life and that remained unchallenged. Several of the younger men had to be restrained from confronting the deputies, their grief seeking any outlet that might provide relief. The procession to the cemetery wound through the streets of Evarts, past the homes of families who stood on their porches in silent tribute, past the school where Michael had excelled. past the hardware store where he had worked summers to save money for college. The entire town seemed to have stopped to honor the young man who would never walk these streets again. By the time the procession reached the cemetery, the line of cars stretched for over a mile. That night, gathered in the main cabin of the Hayes homestead, with Michael's photograph watching from the mantel, the 7 brothers made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. They would not seek justice through a system that had already declared their son's killer innocent. They would not file complaints that would be ignored or hire lawyers who would be outmatched. They would deliver justice themselves in a way that would make clear to everyone in Harlan County that the Hayes family would not accept the murder of their children without response. But they would not kill. That was the decision that set the Hayes brothers apart from the vendetta stories that had defined Appalachian history. They had discussed it through the night, debating whether Whitmore and Morgan and everyone who had enabled them deserved death. In the end, they decided that killing would only bring more killing, would create a cycle of violence that might never end. Instead, they would destroy the infrastructure of the system that had murdered Michael. They would burn the police stations, the physical symbols of the authority that had been used against their family. They would demonstrate that the power of the badge was not absolute, that there were consequences for the abuse of that power. And that decision, made in grief and fury but executed with cold precision, would result in 12 police stations burning across 3 counties over the following 4 months. You see, the Hayes brothers didn't strike randomly or impulsively despite their overwhelming grief and rage. That's right. They understood that emotion-driven violence would only get them caught before they could accomplish their purpose. Instead, they spent the weeks following Michael's funeral gathering intelligence, studying the locations they intended to target, and developing plans for how each station would be destroyed. They met in the evenings, after their families had gone to bed, speaking in low voices about matters they would never discuss in daylight. The skills that the brothers brought to the planning were remarkably well suited to the task they had set for themselves. Samuel's mechanical expertise translated into an understanding of building systems and vulnerabilities, of how structures were put together, and how they could most efficiently be taken apart. David's military training provided knowledge of planning and execution, of how to approach an objective, accomplish a mission, and withdraw without detection. Robert's experience as a mechanic gave him insight into fuel systems and ignition, into how fires started and how they spread. James's combat experience had taught him patience and discipline, the ability to wait for the right moment and strike without hesitation. Together, they formed a team capable of doing what no one in Harlan County would have thought possible. The planning process was methodical and thorough, reflecting the seriousness with which the brothers approached their task. They drove through the county on their normal business, noting the locations of every police facility, observing their construction, identifying potential vulnerabilities. They talked to people who had worked on the buildings, learning details about wiring and plumbing and structural elements that might be relevant. They studied the schedules of deputies, noting when stations were most and least occupied. Every piece of information was filed away, integrated into a picture that grew more complete with each passing day. The question of timing was debated extensively. Some brothers wanted to strike immediately, while the anger was still fresh and the community's sympathy was still with the family. Others argued for patience, for waiting until the investigation into Michael's death had run its course and the official conclusion had been rendered. In the end, they decided to wait for Sheriff Morgan's announcement that the shooting was justified. Understanding that this official sanction of murder would provide moral justification for their response and would make the connection between Michael's death and the fires unmistakable. The decision not to kill was the most significant choice the brothers made. Thomas had argued strongly for this approach, insisting that they were seeking justice, not revenge, and that the killing of their enemies would make them no better than the man who had murdered his son. Others were less certain, pointing out that Whitmore and Morgan deserved death and that leaving them alive might eventually lead to the family's exposure. The debate lasted for several nights before consensus emerged. They would destroy property, not lives. They would send a message about consequences without creating martyrs for the other side. The first target was selected with careful deliberation. They would begin with the substation in Evarts, the building from which Earl Whitmore operated and from which he had driven on the night he killed Michael. It was a small structure, a converted storefront that housed 2 desks, a holding cell, and the paperwork that documented years of abuse. The building was usually empty at night, with deputies patrolling the roads rather than manning the station. It would be easy to destroy, and its destruction would send a message that could not be ignored. The fire was set on a moonless night in early August, 3 weeks after Michael's funeral. Samuel Hayes had spent days studying the building, identifying the best entry points and the most effective locations for accelerant. He had determined that the station's old wiring and wooden construction would make it particularly vulnerable to fire, that once ignited, it would burn too fast for any response to be effective. The brothers approached on foot through the forest behind the building, moving silently through terrain they had known since childhood. The entry was accomplished in minutes, a window jimmied open with tools that Robert had selected for the purpose. Samuel placed containers of gasoline at strategic points throughout the building while his brothers kept watch. When everything was ready, they lit the fuses they had prepared and retreated into the darkness. The fire caught quickly, spreading through the old building with a speed that surprised even Samuel. By the time anyone noticed the flames, the station was fully engulfed, beyond any hope of saving. The Hayes brothers watched from a ridge a mile away as their work completed itself. The destruction of the Evart substation sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community of Harlan County. Sheriff Morgan initially suspected electrical malfunction or accident, but the fire marshal's report made clear that accelerant had been used, that this was arson of a deliberate and professional nature. The discovery triggered a massive investigation, with deputies going door to door throughout the county, seeking information about who might have been responsible. The Hayes family was questioned, of course given their recent loss and their known hostility toward the sheriff's department, but they had prepared their alibis carefully, and no evidence connected them to the fire. The interview with Thomas Hayes was conducted by Sheriff Morgan personally, a confrontation that both men had been anticipating since Michael's death. Morgan arrived at the Hayes homestead with 2 deputies, ostensibly to gather information, but clearly hoping to provoke a reaction that might provide grounds for arrest. Thomas met them on the porch, his face as unreadable as it had been at Michael's funeral, his voice calm and even as he answered their questions. Morgan asked where Thomas had been on the night of the fire. Thomas replied that he had been home, asleep, as his wife could confirm. Morgan asked about his brothers. Thomas replied that he assumed they had been at their own homes, though he could not speak for them with certainty. Morgan asked if Thomas had any knowledge of who might have burned the station. Thomas replied that he did not, that many people in the county had grievances against the sheriff's department, that it could have been anyone. The interview lasted over an hour, with Morgan circling back to the same questions again and again, trying to catch Thomas in a contradiction or provoke an emotional response. Thomas remained calm throughout, answering every question with the same patient courtesy that his father had taught him decades ago. When Morgan finally left, having learned nothing useful, Thomas watched him drive away with the same expressionless face he had maintained throughout the encounter. Only when the car was out of sight did he allow himself a small smile. The brothers had prepared for this scrutiny, had anticipated that they would be among the first suspects, and had developed strategies for deflecting suspicion. They never met all together in the weeks following the first fire, understanding that any gathering of the Hayes brothers would attract attention. They communicated through intermediaries, through messages left in pre-arranged locations, through brief conversations that could be explained as normal family business. The operational security that David had learned in the army proved invaluable, providing frameworks for maintaining secrecy that the civilian brothers might not have developed on their own. The second station burned 2 weeks later, a larger facility in the town of Cumberland that served as a hub for operations throughout the eastern part of the county. This target was more challenging, with more traffic and more potential witnesses, but the brothers had studied it thoroughly and had identified a window of opportunity in the early hours of Sunday morning when the station was minimally staffed and the surrounding streets were empty. The fire was set using the same methods as the first, and the result was equally devastating. The Cumberland station burned to the ground, taking with it records and equipment that would take months to replace. The pattern was established, and the terror began to spread. Law enforcement officials throughout the region recognized that someone was systematically targeting police facilities, though they could not identify who or understand why. The fires were too professional to be the work of common criminals, too precise to be random acts of vandalism. Someone with significant skills was conducting a campaign against the police, and no one could figure out how to stop them. That's right. The Hayes brothers continued their campaign through the fall of 1967, striking with a regularity that kept their enemies constantly off balance. The third target was a station in Harlan proper, the largest facility they had attacked yet, and its destruction required more careful planning and more audacious execution. The station was located in the center of town, surrounded by businesses that stayed open late, monitored by deputies who understood they were now targets. The brothers spent 3 weeks studying the building and its surroundings before identifying an approach that would work. The key to the Harlan attack was a discovery that Samuel made during his reconnaissance. The station shared a wall with an abandoned building that had once housed a hardware store, a building whose rear entrance opened onto an alley that was rarely patrolled. The hardware store had been empty for years, its inventory sold off and its doors locked, but the locks were old and easily defeated. Samuel realized that they could enter the hardware store, break through the shared wall into the station, set their fire, and exit the way they had come, all without ever appearing on the streets that were being watched. The execution of the Harlan attack required all 7 brothers working in coordination, the largest operation they had undertaken so far. 2 brothers created a distraction on the far side of town, drawing deputies away from the station with reports of a fight at a bar. 2 others served as lookouts, positioned to warn of any approaching threat. The remaining 3 entered the hardware store, broke through the wall using tools they had brought for the purpose, and set the fire that would destroy the largest police facility in the county. The entire operation took less than 30 minutes, and by the time the flames were visible from the street, all 7 brothers were miles away. The 4th was a small outpost in Baxter that had been used as a staging area for raids on suspected bootleggers. This target was chosen specifically because of its history, because of the raids that had been launched from this building against families who were simply trying to survive in an economy that offered few legitimate options. The brothers saw the bootleggers not as criminals, but as their neighbors, people who had been forced into illegal activity by circumstances beyond their control and who had been terrorized by deputies operating from this very building. The 5th was a newly built substation in Loyal that had been Sheriff Morgan's pride, a modern facility that was supposed to represent the professionalization of his department. The building had been completed just 6 months earlier, constructed with federal funds that Morgan had secured through his political connections. It featured modern communications equipment, climate control and security measures that were supposed to make it resistant to attack. The brothers viewed its destruction as a personal message to Morgan, a demonstration that his ambitions counted for nothing against their determination. The Loyal attack required different methods than the others, since the building's modern construction made it more resistant to fire. Samuel spent weeks studying the facility, identifying the vulnerabilities in its design, developing an approach that would overcome its protections. He eventually discovered that the building's climate control system drew air from an external vent that was accessible from the roof, that introducing accelerant through this vent would spread fire throughout the building before anyone could respond. The resulting fire was the most intense of the campaign, completely destroying a facility that had been designed to survive exactly such an attack. Each fire was set using methods that left little evidence, that frustrated the investigators who were desperately trying to identify the arsonists. The brothers varied their accelerants, their entry methods, their timing, making it difficult to establish patterns that might help predict or prevent future attacks. They never struck the same area twice in succession, keeping their enemies guessing about where the next blow would fall. They maintained their normal lives during the day, working their jobs and attending to their families, never giving any indication of the activities that occupied their nights. The investigation into the arsons became the largest in Harlan County history, with state police joining local authorities in a desperate effort to identify the perpetrators. Hundreds of people were questioned. Dozens were placed under surveillance. Rewards were offered for information, growing larger as each new fire demonstrated the failure of law enforcement to protect its own facilities. But no useful leads emerged. The Hayes brothers had planned too carefully, had covered their tracks too completely, had maintained their cover too perfectly. The sixth fire came in late September, destroying a police station in Benham that had been built with coal company money and that symbolized the historic alliance between corporate power and law enforcement in the region. The seventh came 2 weeks later, targeting a facility in Lynch that had been used to suppress labor organizing in the mines. Each target was selected not just for its vulnerability, but for its symbolic significance, for what it represented in the long history of oppression that had defined life in these mountains. Sheriff Morgan's response to the crisis became increasingly desperate and increasingly counterproductive. He ordered his deputies to guard the remaining stations around the clock, stretching his already limited manpower to the breaking point. He conducted raids on the homes of anyone he suspected of involvement, raids that produced no evidence, but that alienated communities that might otherwise have cooperated. He made public statements threatening dire consequences for the arsonists, statements that only highlighted his inability to stop them. His authority, which had once seemed absolute, was crumbling with each new fire. The 8th station burned on Halloween night, a particularly audacious attack that seemed almost designed to mock the investigators who had failed to anticipate it. The 9th came in early November, just days before the anniversary of Michael Hayes' birth. The 10th was set on Thanksgiving, when the skeleton crews manning the stations were distracted by thoughts of family and food. Each fire demonstrated that the arsonists could strike at will, that no precaution could guarantee safety, that the power of the police to protect even themselves was an illusion. By December, 12 stations had burned across 3 counties, and the law enforcement community of eastern Kentucky was in a state of near panic. The physical damage was enormous, millions of dollars in buildings and equipment destroyed, but the psychological damage was even greater. Deputies who had once swaggered through these communities now looked over their shoulders constantly, wondering if they might be next. The authority that the badge had always conferred seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a fear that these men had never experienced before. And then, as suddenly as they had begun, the fires stopped. You see, the Hayes brothers had always intended their campaign to be limited, to send a message without creating the kind of chaos that might harm innocent people. That's right. They had set 12 fires, one for each year of Michael's life from the time he could walk until the night he died. The symbolism was deliberate, a private meaning that only the family understood. When the 12th station burned, the reckoning was complete. They would return to their normal lives and never speak of what they had done. The cessation of the fires created almost as much confusion as the fires themselves. Investigators had been preparing for a long campaign, had been developing theories about the arsonists' motivations and methods, had been expecting the attacks to continue indefinitely. The sudden stop suggested that the perpetrators had achieved whatever goal they had set for themselves, that the campaign had been planned from the beginning to end at this specific point. But what that goal might have been remained a mystery. Sarah Collins came forward in January 1968, finally finding the courage to tell authorities what she had witnessed on the night Michael Hayes died. Her testimony contradicted every element of Deputy Whitmore's official report, revealing him as a murderer who had executed an unarmed young man and then fabricated evidence to justify the killing. The revelation forced the State Attorney General to intervene, launching an investigation that would eventually result in Whitmore's indictment for murder and Sheriff Morgan's removal from office. The connection between Michael's death and the arsons was obvious to everyone, though it could never be proven. The Hayes family had the motive, the skills, and the opportunity to have conducted the campaign, but no physical evidence linked them to any of the fires. Investigators were certain they knew who was responsible, but certainty was not proof, and without proof, there could be no prosecution. The Hayes brothers were questioned repeatedly in the months following the fires, but they maintained their innocence with a consistency that their interrogators could not break. Deputy Earl Whitmore was convicted of second-degree murder in October 1968, sentenced to 20 years in prison for the killing of Michael Hayes. The conviction was a landmark in Harlan County history, the first time a law enforcement officer had been held accountable for killing a civilian. It did not bring Michael back, could not erase the grief that had consumed the Hayes family for over a year, but it represented a form of justice that few had believed possible. The trial itself had been a spectacle that drew attention from across Kentucky and beyond. Sarah Collins testified for over 4 hours, recounting what she had seen on that summer night with a clarity and conviction that the defense could not shake. She described Whitmore's unprovoked attack on Michael, described the young man's desperate attempt to flee, described the shots that cut him down as he ran. She described Whitmore standing over the body, breathing heavily, before placing the tire iron that would become the centerpiece of his false report. The defense had tried to discredit her testimony, had suggested that she was too far away to see clearly, that her memory had been influenced by the community's sympathy for the Hayes family, that she had reasons of her own to lie about what had happened. Sarah Collins had endured the cross-examination with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout her testimony, answering every question calmly and completely, never wavering in her account of what she had witnessed. By the time she stepped down from the stand, even the jurors who had come in skeptical appeared convinced. Other witnesses had corroborated elements of her testimony. Her forensic expert testified that the tire iron showed no fingerprints consistent with Michael having held it, that the placement of the weapon near the body was inconsistent with it having been dropped during a struggle. A pathologist testified that the wounds in Michael's back were inconsistent with the self-defense scenario that Whitmore had described, that the shots had been fired from a distance and at an angle that suggested flight rather than attack. The physical evidence told a story that contradicted everything in the official report. Whitmore himself had testified in his own defense, repeating the version of events he had put in his report, insisting that Michael had attacked him and that he had fired only to protect his life. Under cross-examination, his story had fallen apart, contradicted by the physical evidence and by the testimony of witnesses he had not known existed. By the time the prosecution finished with him, he appeared not just guilty, but pathetic, a small man who had murdered a teenager and then tried to lie his way out of accountability. Thomas Hayes attended every day of the trial, watching silently as the man who had murdered his son was finally forced to answer for his crime. He sat in the same seat each day, in the front row behind the prosecution table, his eyes fixed on Whitmore whenever the deputy was in the courtroom. He never spoke, never made any gesture that might have been interpreted as threatening or inappropriate. His presence was enough, a silent reminder of what this trial was really about, of the family that had been destroyed by the defendant's actions. When the verdict was announced, Thomas showed no reaction, simply nodded once and left the courtroom. His brothers were waiting outside, all 6 of them standing together for the first time since the fires had ended. They did not speak, did not embrace, simply stood in silence for a moment before dispersing to their separate vehicles. The reckoning they had delivered had been answered by a different kind of justice, and both together had accomplished what neither could have achieved alone. Sheriff Luther Morgan was removed from office by the governor in early 1969, his career destroyed by the scandal that had engulfed his department. He was never charged with any crime related to Michael's death or the cover-up that followed, but his political allies abandoned him, and he spent his remaining years in bitter obscurity. The department he had built was dismantled and rebuilt under new leadership, with policies designed to prevent the kinds of abuses that had characterized his tenure. The transformation was incomplete, as all such transformations are, but it represented genuine change. The Hayes brothers returned to their lives, raising their children, working their jobs, growing old in the mountains they had never left. They never spoke publicly about the arsons, never admitted their involvement even to close friends, never sought recognition for what they had accomplished. The reckoning they had delivered was its own reward, a message sent and received, a demonstration that power had limits and that abuse would have consequences. They had changed something, had shifted something in the balance between the people and those who claimed authority over them. The years that followed were remarkably peaceful for the Hayes family. The scrutiny that had followed them during and after the fires gradually faded as investigators turned their attention to other cases and other problems. The brothers resumed the rhythms of their ordinary lives, farming and working and raising the next generation of Hayes children. They gathered for holidays and family events, but they never spoke of what they had done together, maintaining the silence that had protected them from the beginning. Each brother processed the experience differently. Thomas, who had lost the most, found a measure of peace in the conviction of his son's killer and in the changes that followed the reckoning. He devoted his remaining years to the family farm and to his grandchildren, trying to give them the opportunities that Michael had been denied. William continued working until black lung forced him out, then spent his retirement sitting on his porch and watching the mountains he had known all his life. James remained hard and withdrawn, the combat veteran who had added another war to those he carried inside him. Robert expanded his garage into a successful business, eventually employing a dozen mechanics and serving customers from throughout the county. Charles became active in local politics, working through legitimate channels to achieve the kinds of changes that the fires had helped to initiate. David used his military training to start a security consulting business, advising companies on how to protect their facilities from exactly the kinds of attacks he had once helped to plan. Samuel became the county's most sought-after repairman, his mechanical genius applied to peaceful purposes for the rest of his life. The secret they shared created a bond that went beyond even the normal closeness of brothers. They had done something together that could never be undone, had shared experiences that could never be discussed with anyone outside their circle. This secret became a kind of inheritance, passed down to their children and grandchildren, a family history that was known but never spoken. The Hayes family became known throughout the county as people who kept their word and kept their counsel, whose loyalty to each other was absolute, and whose silence could be trusted. The reckoning they had delivered was its own reward, a message sent and received, a demonstration that power had limits and that abuse would have consequences. The aftermath of the Kentucky Reckoning, as it came to be known, reshaped law enforcement in eastern Kentucky for a generation. The destruction of 12 stations, combined with the exposure of corruption and brutality at the highest levels of the sheriff's department, forced reforms that had been resisted for decades. Civilian oversight boards were established. Complaint procedures were implemented. Training programs were developed that emphasized community relations rather than mere enforcement. The changes were imperfect and often superficial, but they represented acknowledgement that the old ways could not continue. The physical rebuilding took years. Some of the destroyed stations were replaced with modern facilities that incorporated lessons learned from the fires. Others were never rebuilt, their functions consolidated into larger regional centers that could be better protected. The landscape of law enforcement in the region was permanently altered, a visible reminder of the reckoning that had swept through these mountains in the fall of 1967. Thomas Hayes lived another 23 years after the fires, dying in 1990 at the age of 74. He never remarried after his wife's death in 1982, never recovered entirely from the loss of his only son. He was buried in the cemetery beside the church in Evarts, his grave near the spot where Michael had been laid to rest over 2 decades earlier. The headstone bore only his name and dates, but everyone who visited knew the larger story, knew what Thomas Hayes and his brothers had done in response to an injustice that the official system had refused to address. The other brothers followed over the years, each dying in his own time, each taking his secrets to the grave. William passed in 1995, James in 1998, Robert in 2001, Charles in 2004, David in 2008, and finally Samuel in 2012, the last survivor of the 7 who had gathered that night after Michael's funeral to plan their response. None of them ever confessed, ever wrote a memoir, ever gave an interview about what had happened. The truth of their involvement was known within the family and suspected outside it, but it was never confirmed. The story of the Hayes brothers passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. Songs were written about them, ballads that celebrated their courage and mourned the death that had sparked their campaign. Some portrayed them as heroes who had struck a blow against a corrupt system. Others painted them as dangerous vigilantes who had taken the law into their own hands. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. The songs that emerged from the Kentucky Reckoning varied widely in their approach and their message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, beginning with Michael's death and ending with the last fire. Others focused on particular moments, dramatizing the planning sessions or the execution of individual attacks. The most famous of these songs, known simply as 12 Stations Burning, was composed in 1970 by a folk singer from Lexington who had heard the story from people who had known the family. His song has been performed at folk festivals throughout Appalachia and recorded by dozens of artists over the decades since. Other songs took different perspectives on the events. One ballad told the story from the viewpoint of a deputy who watched his station burn, trying to understand the forces that had been unleashed against him. Another focused on Sarah Collins, the witness whose courage had eventually helped convict Michael's killer. Still another imagined the thoughts of Michael himself, looking down from heaven as his family delivered the reckoning he could not have delivered himself. The variety of these songs reflected the complexity of the story itself, the way it resisted easy interpretation. The Kentucky reckoning also attracted attention from journalists and historians who saw in the events a reflection of broader themes in American history. Articles appeared in regional magazines and academic journals, analyzing the arsons as expressions of rural resistance to state authority, as manifestations of the social upheaval that characterized the late 1960s, as case studies in vigilante justice and its consequences. A documentary film was produced in the 1990s, featuring interviews with community members who remembered the fires and their aftermath. Historians who have studied the Kentucky reckoning have reached varying conclusions about its significance and its meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of rural resistance to state authority, part of a long tradition of mountain people refusing to accept the legitimacy of systems imposed from outside. Others have focused on the specific context of 1967, seeing in the arsons a reflection of the broader social upheaval that was transforming America. Still others have examined the failure of the justice system, arguing that the Hayes brothers' actions were a predictable response to a situation in which legitimate avenues for redress had been closed. You see, what the Hayes brothers did cannot be justified by any conventional legal framework. They destroyed public property, endangered lives, and took justice into their own hands in a way that any functioning society must condemn. The fact that no one was killed in the fires was a matter of careful planning. Not luck, but the potential for tragedy was present in every attack. If even one person had died, the moral calculus would have been entirely different. The brothers understood this, had planned to avoid casualties precisely because they did not want to become the thing they were fighting against. And yet their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that arson is wrong. They were a family whose son had been murdered by a law enforcement officer who faced no accountability through official channels. The system that should have punished Whitmore had instead protected him, had declared his actions justified, had made clear that the life of Michael Hayes had no value in the eyes of the law. What options did they have? What would any family do when faced with such impossible loss and such complete absence of legitimate recourse? Their story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The fires they set were crimes, there is no denying that. But the killing that provoked them was also a crime that was being ignored and excused by the very institutions responsible for preventing and punishing such acts. The Hayes brothers created accountability where none existed, demonstrated that power had limits, and forced changes that benefited everyone who lived under the authority of Harlan County law enforcement. The specific circumstances that produced the Kentucky reckoning have changed in the decades since those fires burned. The coal industry that once dominated eastern Kentucky has largely collapsed, transforming communities that had been defined by mining for generations. The civil rights movement has reshaped laws and expectations about police conduct, creating formal protections that did not exist in 1967. The oversight mechanisms that were established in the wake of the arsons have evolved and expanded, providing channels for complaint and accountability that were unavailable to the Hayes family. But the underlying tensions that produced the conflict have not disappeared entirely. Police brutality remains a reality in communities throughout America, disproportionately affecting the poor and marginalized. Cover-ups and false reports still protect officers who abuse their authority. The gap between law and justice, between what the system promises and what it delivers, remains wide enough to generate rage and despair. The story of the Hayes brothers serves as a reminder of what can happen when that gap becomes unbridgeable, when people lose faith in institutions that are supposed to protect them. The descendants of the Hayes family still live in those Kentucky hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and complexity. Some have become police officers themselves, trying to reform the system from within. Others have become lawyers and advocates, working through legitimate channels to achieve the accountability that their ancestors sought through fire. All of them, in one way or another, have been shaped by events that occurred over half a century ago, a reckoning that defined their family in ways that cannot be escaped or forgotten. The sites where the 12 stations once stood are mostly forgotten now, absorbed into a landscape that has changed dramatically since 1967. Some locations have been built over, transformed into stores or homes or parking lots that give no indication of what once stood there. Others remain empty, vacant lots that local people avoid without quite knowing why. The physical evidence of the Kentucky reckoning has largely disappeared, but the memory lingers in stories passed down through families and in the changed relationship between police and community that the fires helped to create. The mountains of Harlan County remain today much as they were in 1967, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The creeks still flow cold and clear. The trees still change color each autumn. The hollows still shelter families whose names have been associated with this land for generations. The coal mines that once employed thousands are mostly closed now, their entrances sealed, their communities struggling to find new ways to survive. Those who remain still tell stories about the Hayes brothers, about the reckoning and its consequences, about what happens when powerful institutions fail the people they are supposed to serve. The story of the Hayes brothers endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of family loyalty, and what that loyalty becomes when it is tested by ultimate loss. It is the story of power and its abuse, of systems that fail, and people who find ways to respond. It is the story of fire as a force of destruction and transformation, burning away the old to make way for something new. It is, finally, a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where the Hayes brothers stood, to see the hollow where they planned their campaign and the graves where they rest with the son, whose death started everything? Would you walk the roads where Michael drove on his final night, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hills since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the hollow where the Hayes homestead stood is difficult to access without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs, the mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of the Hayes brothers close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows, and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. Their story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Harlan County in 1967, as long as families love their children with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as systems fail and people find ways to respond. They are gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the hollow they loved, but what they did and what was done to their family echoes still through time, and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Hayes brothers, who burned 12 police stations after police killed their son Michael on a summer night in 1967. A story of love and loss, of fire and fury, of justice found where the law could not provide it. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.